The estate had been empty for 11 years before I started working there, and the man who hired me, Corin Veth, the owner's solicitor, a thin fellow who wore the same brown coat every time I saw him, made a point of telling me that 3 times in our first meeting, 11 years, as if the emptiness itself were a credential. As if I needed to understand that the house had been alone for a very long time before I came, and that its habits were set, and that I should not be alarmed by anything I heard inside it. I was 53 years old. I had been cleaning other people's houses for 26 of those years. I was not easily alarmed. The estate sat at the far edge of Orithville Station's settled fringe, past the last of the row houses, past the grain depot and the cold storage warehouse, up a long gravel lane that turned to mud in the wet season and froze solid in the dry one. The house itself was stone, 3 stories, with a slate roof that had given way in 2 places over the 11-year vacancy and been patched imperfectly with gray foam sealant that did not match anything. The grounds had gone to seed. There was a courtyard at the back, paved in old terracotta tile, with a rusted garden gate that led out onto scrubland. The windows were shuttered from the inside. The shutters were warped. Corin Veth gave me a key, a monthly rate, and 4 instructions. Dust the main rooms on the ground floor. Keep the heating coils from seizing. Note any structural damage for the eventual sale. And do not go into the east wing above the first floor, because the floor joists were questionable. I said I understood. I started the following Monday. The first 3 visits were straightforward. I was learning the house, which is always the first work, before the actual work, and I have never begrudged it. You have to know a building before you can care for it properly. You have to know where the cold comes in, and where the damp sits, and which floors creak at which point in their board run, and what the windows sound, like when the wind is from the north versus the east. You have to know the smell of the place. Old stone, old plaster, the particular staleness of a room that has been shut for a long time without being aired, the mineral sharpness of pipes that haven't run in months. You learn to read a building the way you learn to read any long-standing situation, not by being told about it, but by moving through it slowly and paying attention. The Veth estate was not in poor repair for what it was. 11 years of vacancy had done what 11 years of vacancy does, softened some things, hardened others, let things settle into its own weight in the way buildings do when no one is making demands of them. The east wing joists that Corin Veth had warned me about turned out to be fine. I did not test them immediately, but I walked the first floor corridor and felt no flex in the boards, which is a better test than any survey report I have ever read. The roof patches were adequate. The heating coil system was an older model, but had been maintained in the years before the vacancy. When I got it running, it ran without complaint. The shutters were warped enough to let in drafts, but not enough to let in weather. The plasterwork in most rooms was intact. It was a house that had been empty a long time and knew it, and had not entirely made peace with it, but was managing. I cleaned what needed cleaning. I logged what needed logging. I kept my pace even, and my observations precise, the way 26 years of the work will teach you. The sound I first noticed was on my 3rd visit. It was a sound below hearing, almost. A subsonic regularity that you felt in the sternum more than you heard with the ears. It came from the upper east wing, the part I wasn't meant to visit, and it occurred every 40 minutes or so with the reliability of a machine. I assumed, that first morning, that it was a pipe. Old stone houses make sounds. The heating coils cycled. Things expanded and contracted in the cold. I wrote it down in my notebook under the heading Structural, East Upper, and thought nothing more of it until the following visit, when I noticed that the tray of seed I had left on the kitchen windowsill for the yard birds, a habit I carry from house to house because birds keep a building feeling alive, had been dragged 3 feet along the counter overnight, and every seed was gone. The yard birds could not have reached the counter. The windows were shuttered. I reset the tray. I put it further back from the window. I added a small ceramic dish of water beside it. On my next visit, the tray was in the same position I had left it. The water dish was empty. The seeds were gone. I sat in the cold kitchen for a while after I found that. I am not, by temperament, a person who invents explanations. I had seen enough houses, enough neglected buildings, enough things that people called infestations, and that turned out to be perfectly ordinary, animals making perfectly ordinary use of an empty space, to understand that a building left alone long enough will always find a tenant. A mouse, a nest of wiring birds, something that lived in the walls and came out at night and ate seeds and drank water and left no other trace. I bought a larger bag of seed on the way home. I also bought a tin of dried protein cubes, the compressed kind, sold for working yard animals, because whatever was living in the walls of the Veth estate on the outer fringe of Orithvel station, it had drunk a full ceramic dish of water, and I thought it was probably hungry. I left the protein cubes beside the seed tray and did not mention any of it to Veth. That is where the 2 years begin, if you are looking for a starting point. That ceramic dish and that tin of protein cubes, and me deciding not to mention it. I did not see it, clearly, properly, with good light, until the 7th week. What I had seen before that were fragments. A shape withdrawing around the corner of the upper landing, when I climbed the stairs past the east wing door. A gleam of something, amber, reflective, catching the morning light through a cracked shutter. Gone before I could focus on it. A sound that I came to think of as breathing, though I could not have explained why. It had a rhythm and a depth that felt biological rather than mechanical, a little too variable for any pipe or coil I had ever heard. I had not told Veth. I want to be clear about why. It was not because I thought I knew what it was. I did not know what it was. It was because I was 53 years old and had spent 26 years cleaning other people's houses, and in that time I had learned that a living thing hiding in a derelict space is, almost without exception, hiding because the alternative is worse. You do not report a thing like that. You leave food and water, and you do not make fast movements near the upper landing, and you let whatever it is decide in its own time whether you are safe. That is the whole of my philosophy on the matter, and I have never needed a more complicated one. The 7th week was a dry season morning, cold enough that my breath made mist in the kitchen. I had arrived early to run the heating coils before the frost set in properly. I was on my knees in the pantry, checking the coil housing at the base of the north wall, when I heard the breathing sound directly above me. Not upstairs above me, but above me in the wall, inside the stone itself where the old service duct ran. And then, at the far end of the pantry, where the lowest shelf had been removed and left a gap wide enough to slide a hand into, something moved. I did not move. I stayed on my knees with my hand on the coil housing, and I looked at the gap in the shelf and I waited. What came out was small. Much smaller than the breathing had led me to expect, and it came out one limb at a time with the cautious, measuring deliberateness of an animal that has learned, the hard way, to check every exit before committing to it. First a forelimb, four-fingered, scaled in a deep copper rose that went almost violet at the joints, tipped with claws that were still translucent at the tips the way very young things are before the keratin hardens fully. Then a head. I will try to describe it accurately, because it matters that you understand what I actually saw, and not a softened version of it. It was the head of a dragon. Not a creature that resembled a dragon in some metaphorical or impressionistic way. A dragon, the way you know one, the way everyone in the 12 systems knows one from the records and the colony histories and the old freight captain's logs that everyone's grandparents read. Scaled, horned, 2 short horn nubs above the eye ridges, still growing in, not yet the tall sweeping ridges they would eventually become. A jaw that was broader at the base than at the snout, built for crushing rather than tearing, which in a young one reads less as threatening and more as disproportionate, like a puppy whose paws are still too large. And the eyes, amber gold, very large relative to the skull, vertically slit-pupilled, and catching the thin morning light from the cracked shutter in a way that made them glow faintly. It looked at me. I looked at it. It was breathing in that subsonic rhythm I had been hearing for 7 weeks, and now that I could see the source I could understand why it felt biological. The rib cage, visible through the copper rose scales in the way a young animal's ribs are visible when it hasn't been eating enough, moved with each breath, slow and careful, as though breathing were something that required effort. It was thin. I had fed it seed and protein cubes for 7 weeks, and it was still thin. The scales along its flank were dull rather than bright. The copper rose gone matte in a way I would later understand meant poor health, and the wing membranes that were just beginning to unfurl along its back, crumpled still, not yet extended, the way a newly emerged insect's wings look before they fill, were folded tight against its body in the posture of something that is conserving everything it has. We looked at each other for what I estimate was about 90 seconds. Then it pulled its head back into the gap in the shelf and was gone. I finished checking the coil housing. I wrote coils nominal in my notebook. I noted that the lower pantry shelf would need to be refitted eventually and the gap behind it cleared. I did not write anything else. On the way home, I stopped at the provisioning market and bought a packet of fresh-cut protein strips, the kind sold for working yard drakes, large animals that needed a proper meat-based ration, and a block of rendered fat and grain that the market woman called a growth block, and which was sold for adolescent domestic drakes that were running underweight. I also bought a second ceramic dish. I left the protein strips and the growth block in the pantry that evening, not in the gap behind the shelf, not close enough to feel like a trap. I left them on the floor in the middle of the pantry, with the second ceramic dish filled with water, and I shut the pantry door from the outside when I left. On my next visit, both dishes were empty, and the growth block had been moved to the back corner and half consumed. I bought 2 growth blocks the following week. This was the shape of things for the next 4 months. I came to the estate 3 mornings a week. I did my work. The dusting, the coil checks, the damage noting, the slow, methodical maintenance of a building that was waiting to be sold. And I left food in the pantry. The tray on the counter continued to be cleaned out. The ceramic dishes continued to be emptied. I bought a proper water container, a large one, the kind used for yard animals, and I filled it at the kitchen tap before I left each time. I left it inside the pantry with the door propped open. I varied the food. This was not strategy, exactly, more the instinct of someone who had kept yard birds and the occasional domestic drake and understood that a growing animal needs more than one thing. I kept the protein strips and the growth blocks as the base. I added dried fish meal some weeks, when the provisioning market had it cheaply, and grain paste others. Once I brought the carcass of a large fowl left over from a meal I had made for myself. It seemed wasteful not to, and left it in the pantry and came back the next visit to find the bones cleaned with a thoroughness that told me something about what the thing in the walls was built to do when it was eating properly. After that, I started asking the butcher at the provisioning market for bone-in cuts. He assumed I had taken on a large working drake and charged me accordingly. I did not correct him. The expense was not negligible on my income. I did not examine this fact too closely. People spend money on things that matter to them, and I had decided, without quite deciding it in so many words, that this mattered. Corin Veth called me twice in those 4 months. Once to ask how the heating coils were holding up. Fine. And once to tell me the sale had fallen through on account of the East Wing joist issue, and the estate would remain in the family trust for the foreseeable future, and I should continue my work. I said I would. I asked, during that second call, whether the estate had ever had a problem with animals getting in, not phrased as a complaint, phrased as the kind of question a conscientious cleaner asks so she knows what she is dealing with. Corin Veth said there had been a report of some kind of nesting situation in the East Wing some years back, and that the previous cleaner had recommended a pest control firm, but that the owner had declined on the grounds of expense, and the previous cleaner had then left the position, and that Corin Veth, had always assumed the problem had resolved itself. I said that was likely what had happened. I said I would continue to monitor. He thanked me, and the call ended. The village, the settled fringe of Orithvel Station's outer ring, 40 or so houses clustered around the grain depot, and the 2 small commercial streets, had over the years developed a mythology about the Veth estate. Haunted was the most common version. Infested was the second most common. A woman at the provisioning market who had lived in the outer fringe her whole life told me, the second autumn I was working there, that 3 different families had tried to take on the lease in the years after the vacancy began, and that every one of them had left within a month, without explanation, and that the last of them, a young couple with 2 children, had reportedly told anyone who would listen that the house made. Sounds and the food went missing, and there was something living in the walls that left claw marks in the plaster. I said that sounded like the sort of story that grows in the telling. She looked at me the way village women look at someone who has declined to agree with them, and said she was only repeating what she had heard. I said I appreciated it. I bought my growth blocks and went back to work. The claw marks in the plaster were real. I had seen them, not in the inhabited parts of the house, but in the upper East Wing corridor beyond the questionable joist door, which I had eventually opened, because I needed to understand the extent of the structural issues, and because the joist, when I actually stood on it, turned out to bear weight perfectly well. The marks ran in pairs along the base of the walls at roughly a hand's span. Above the floor, close together, consistent spacing. They were the marks of an animal that paced the corridor at night. The depth of the oldest ones and the shallower depth of the newest ones told a story. Whatever made them had been making them for years, and either it was getting lighter as time went on, or it was getting more careful. I bought a pot of wall filler and filled the oldest ones on the lower floors. I left the east wing corridor alone. By the end of the first year, I had a reasonable understanding of its patterns. It was nocturnal by preference, but not strictly. On overcast mornings when the shuttered house was dim enough, it would sometimes move through the ground floor rooms while I was working. I would hear it in the walls, tracking me room to room. Once, when I was on my knees in the entrance hall replacing a loose floor tile, I heard it come through the service hatch above the wainscoting and felt the slight shift in air temperature that I had come to associate with its presence. It ran a few degrees warmer than the ambient, the way a large warm-blooded animal does in a cold house, and I looked up to find it, sitting on top of the wainscoting 6 feet away, watching me grout the tile. It had grown. In 7 months of regular feeding, it had grown noticeably. The scales had brightened. The copper rose was richer now, the violet deepening at the joints and spreading in a banding pattern down the neck and along the leading edge of the wing membranes, which were fuller now, still folded but clearly growing into something. The ribs were no longer visible. The horn nubs had extended to small but definite ridges. It was still small, perhaps the size of a large domestic drake, the kind kept for orchard work, but it carried itself differently than it had in the pantry. Less tight, less as though breathing were an effort. I said good morning to it. I went back to grouting the tile. It watched me for perhaps 10 minutes, and then it was gone, back through the service hatch, and I heard it moving up through the walls toward the east wing. I put this in no notebook. I did not call Coran Veth. I want to say something about why not, because I have been asked this since, by the Transit Authority liaison officer and by others, and my answer is always the same, and it always seems insufficient to the people asking it, which is why I will try to say it here more carefully than I managed in those conversations. I did not report it because I had looked at it. That is the simplest version. I had crouched in the pantry doorway in the cold morning light and looked at what was in the walls of the Veth estate, and what I had seen was not a pest control problem. What I had seen was something thin and alone and hungry that had been surviving in an empty building for years on birds and insects, and whatever else it could find, that came to the pantry gap with the careful deliberateness of an animal that expects to be driven off, and that watched me with eyes that were too large for its head, and had in them something I recognized without knowing how to name it, the recognition of a mind behind them, the particular focus of something that is trying to understand its situation and working hard at it with the resources it has. You do not call pest control for that. Or perhaps other people do. I did not. What I thought about, in the evenings when I was back in my own small flat on the mid-ring, was the kind of thing a person thinks about when they have decided to keep a secret and are beginning to understand the dimensions of it. Not regret. I did not feel regret, but a kind of steady accounting. I was keeping something alive. I did not know what it was, exactly, in the way of lineage or significance, or why it was hiding in a stone estate, house on the outer fringe of Orithvel Station. I knew it was a dragon, because it was a dragon. There was nothing else it could be, nothing in the 12 systems that looked like what I had seen in the pantry that morning. I knew it was young. I knew it was alone. I knew it had been alone for a long time, before I started leaving food, because the way it ate in the early months, desperate, total, not a grain left, was the eating of something that had been rationing itself to survive. Whatever had happened to bring it here, it had been managing alone for years. It had survived on what it could find in an empty house. Birds that got in through the broken shutters, insects, whatever organic material it could scavenge from an 11 years empty building. That it had survived it all on that, through the cold seasons, was something I tried not to think about too directly, because it made my chest hurt in a way I did not have useful language for. I was not a person of rank. I was not a diplomat or a freight captain or a colonial administrator. I was a housekeeper, 53 years old, with a small flat and a provisioning market habit, and a notebook full of damage assessments for buildings other people owned. I did not know what the protocols were for a situation like this. I was not sure protocols existed. I was fairly certain that if I told anyone, Coran Veth, the village, the transit authority, the pest control firm the previous cleaner had recommended, the outcome would not be good for the creature in the walls. I thought about this possibility, the pest control firm specifically, more than once in those 2 years. I thought about what it would have looked like if I had called them in the 7th week, if I had phoned Coran Veth after I saw it in the pantry and reported a significant animal presence in the east wing requiring professional removal. It would have been the sensible thing. It would have been the thing that any reasonable person in my position, with my responsibilities toward the estate and the owner's legal interests, would have been expected to do. I know this. I chose not to do the sensible thing. I chose instead to buy a second growth block and keep my notebook entries factual and let the matter resolve itself on its own terms over whatever time it needed. So I kept my accounting private, and I kept buying growth blocks, and I said good morning when I saw it, and I did not tell anyone. The second winter was harder than the first. There was a 3-week cold stretch in the middle of the dry season, a thermal inversion that dropped the outer fringe temperatures below what the heating coils could fully compensate for, and I came in on the second morning of it to find the pantry door open and the water in the large yard, animal container frozen solid across the top. I broke the ice with the handle of my grouting trowel and refilled it from the tap, and I went upstairs, past the east wing door, through it, down the corridor, and I knocked on the wall at the spot where I had heard it most consistently, and I said, out loud, into the stone corridor, "The kitchen is warmer than up here. I've put fresh water down. Come down if you want." I felt slightly foolish saying it. I am not given to talking to myself or to walls. I went back downstairs and I got on with dusting the front rooms. By the time I had finished the front rooms and made my way to the kitchen to fill my flask, it was in the kitchen. Not in the walls, in the kitchen, on the floor in the corner between the coal storage alcove and the back wall, which was the warmest corner in the room because the coil housing ran behind it, and it had folded itself into that corner with the neat compactness of a large animal that has found a warm enough space and is not moving. I filled my flask. I put another growth block down near it, not close enough to crowd it, and a fresh protein strip from the packet I had brought. I poured myself tea from the kitchen kettle. I had started bringing in my bag after the first winter, because the estate had no working kettle of its own and cold mornings in an empty house are long. I drank my tea. It ate the growth block. We were both in the warm corner and neither of us said anything, and the cold pressed against the stone walls outside, and the heating coil behind the alcove ticked and hummed. It stayed on the ground floor for the rest of the cold stretch. I know because I could track it by the warm spot it left on the floor tiles when it moved. A housekeeper learns the temperature of every floor in her buildings, and because once, on the fourth day, it was in the hallway when I arrived and it did not move away immediately when I opened the door. It looked at me from the hallway floor with those amber gold eyes. And I looked at it, and I said good morning, and I hung my coat up, and we got on with the day. It was larger by the second winter than I would have predicted from the first year's growth rate. Not dramatically so, but meaningfully. The wing membranes had filled out to the point where it could extend them partially. I saw it do this once in the hallway, a slow extension like a person stretching arms wide in the morning, and the span was already considerable. Copper rose shading to deep violet at the trailing edge, the membrane translucent enough in full extension to see the structural webbing of the bone inside. The horn ridges were proper ridges now. The claws had gone fully opaque and hard, dark at the base, lighter at the tips. It was not a small animal anymore, not a domestic drake. Something older and larger, and the word I kept coming back to was not dangerous or threatening but authoritative, in the way a thing carries itself when it is beginning to understand what it is. In the second winter I started talking to it more. Not because I thought it understood me in the way another person would, but because it seemed to settle it, or perhaps me. I was never entirely sure which of us I was managing. I talked about the building. I told it what I had found in each room. The damp patch in the east wing sitting room that needed attention before it reached the plaster. The loose casement on the third floor window that I had shimmed with a folded piece of card. The tile in the entrance hall that I had regrouted 3 times now because the substrate beneath it was soft. I talked about the building the way I always talked to myself while I worked, except now there was something in the room that turned its head when I spoke and watched me with focused, steady attention. I talked about other things too, sometimes when the work was going slowly or the cold was particularly present. Small things, the provisioning market, the grain depot repair they had been doing on the main street for 3 months now, the yarn over pattern I was trying on a project I had started in the evenings and kept miscounting. I am not sure why. The habit of talking to something that is listening, maybe. There is a quality to being listened to that a person can recognize without being able to point to what demonstrates it, and whatever was in the walls of the Veth estate on those cold mornings was listening. Not performing attention, actually listening. It never made sounds at me, no vocalization I could point to and say, That was a response, but it watched me. It tracked me through rooms, and once, in the third month of that winter, I had been going through the upper corridor with my damaged notebook, and my torch and I had misjudged the top step of the landing stair and caught the wall instead of the banister. Once, when I stumbled and made a sharp sound of surprise, it was in the corridor within a minute, not fast, not alarmed, just present. It looked at me, and I looked at it, and I showed it my hands, unhurt, and it went back to wherever it had come from. I thought about that for a while. I thought about what it meant that it had heard me stumble and look. I did not draw any large conclusions from it. I noted it in the private part of my mind, where I kept the things I did not write in the damaged notebook, and I went on with my work. The sale attempt came back in the spring of the second year. Corin Veth called me on a Tuesday morning while I was walking up the gravel lane to the estate and told me that a buyer had expressed serious interest. A development consortium from the mid-ring, he said, the kind that buys old fringe estates and converts them to transit worker accommodation, and that a structural survey was being scheduled, and I should make sure the main rooms were presentable and the east wing access was clear. I said I understood. I asked, as neutrally as I could manage, what timeline they were working to. He said the survey was in 3 weeks. I said that was fine. I said I would make sure everything was in order. I ended the call, and I stood on the gravel lane in the early spring cold with my bag on my shoulder, and I thought about what 3 weeks meant. 3 weeks to a survey that would go through every room, including the east wing. A survey conducted by people who would not, under any circumstances, respond to the discovery of a subadult dragon inhabiting the upper floors in the way that I had responded. I thought about this carefully. Then I went inside, and I went to the east wing corridor, and I knocked on the wall in the place where it most often was, and I said, "Something is going to happen to this building in 3 weeks. People will come and go through every room. I don't know what that means for you. I think you should know." I was not sure what I expected. I was not sure I expected anything. What happened was, the walls stayed quiet for a moment, and then the breathing sound, the subsonic regularity I had first heard in my third week, started up, close to the plaster, and stayed there for a while. I put my hand on the wall above the skirting board, and I could feel it. The faint warmth, the vibration of that slow rhythm. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry. I went downstairs, and I did my work, and I tried to think of what could be done, and I could not think of what could be done, and in the end I decided that what I could do was the same thing I had been doing for 2 years, which was to keep the building in good order and the food and water available, and trust that a creature that had survived 11 years of vacancy and 2 cold winters on its own resources was not without resources." The survey was canceled 10 days later. The development consortium had reviewed the East Wing structural report and determined that the remediation costs exceeded their margin. Corin Veth called me to say the estate was, once again, off the market. I said I was sorry to hear that. He said these things happened. I went upstairs and knocked on the east wing wall and said, "It fell through. You're all right. I am aware that this is not rational behavior. I cleaned the estate for 2 years, fed a dragon I could not name or classify or explain, talked to it through walls, and reported nothing to anyone. I am not offering this as a model for anyone's conduct. I am only telling you what I did. What I did not know, what I had no way of knowing, in those 2 years on the outer fringe of Orath Vel Station, was that 14 ships had been searching for what was in those walls. I did not know this because no one told me. No one told me because I was a housekeeper, and no one tells housekeepers things of that magnitude. I had no access to transit authority bulletins. I did not read colonial administration news. I was in a stone house on the outer fringe of a waystation world, 3 times a week, and what I knew of the wider situation was what the provisioning market woman told me, which was not much, and what Corin Veth told me, which was even less. I learned about the search later, much later, and all at once, on a morning in early autumn of the second year. It was a clear day. Cold, but clear, the dry season chill that had not yet turned to frost, with the early light coming flat and white across the scrubland at the back of the estate, and through the cracks in the rear shutters. I had arrived at my usual time. I had put down the morning food in the pantry. I had started on the ground floor dusting. I became aware of the sound before I could have said what it was. A deep structural sound, below the register of anything the building produced. Not a pipe, not a coil, not the gravel lane settling in the frost. Something outside the building, and very large. Several somethings. Moving in a formation that I could feel in the floor tiles through my work shoes. I went to the back of the house. I unlatched the rear door, the one that opened onto the courtyard and the rusted garden gate, and I stepped outside. The sky above the Veth estate was not empty. I will not pretend I understood immediately what I was seeing. I understood it in pieces, the way you understand any very large thing. First the nearest part, then the next, then the scale. What I first saw was shadow. The shadow of something very large passing between the early sun and the courtyard, moving slowly from east to west. Then I looked up and saw the shape that cast it. And then I looked further up and saw the rest of them. 14 ships. That is what I was eventually told. In the moment, standing in the courtyard in my work coat with my dusting cloth still in my hand, I could not have counted them. What I saw was a formation, dragon ships, clearly dragon-built. The hull profiles curved and scaled in the architectural language of the Great Lines, not the angular transit authority geometry I was used to, not the freighter box of the mid-ring, moving at low altitude directly over the outer fringe of Orithvel Station, moving toward the estate. They were not quiet. They had the deep bone vibration of very large things that are very carefully not going fast, the kind of low speed that costs something enormous to maintain, and the air around them had a quality I had never felt before. Not wind, not propulsion wash, something warmer and older, like the air in a room where a fire has been burning for a very long time. I stood in the courtyard, and I looked up at them, and I thought, with the clarity that sometimes comes in moments of complete incomprehension, I have done something. I did not know what. I did not know if it was the right thing. The settled fringe was visible from where I stood, the grain depot, the row houses, the 2 commercial streets. And I could see, even in instance, that people had come outside and were standing in the lanes and the doorways and looking up. The Veth estate had a mythology in the village. Whatever the village made of 14 dragon ships descending over it in the early autumn morning was not something I had the capacity to calculate just then. I stood there with my dusting cloth behind me, through the rear door of the estate, through the kitchen, up through the walls. I heard the breathing rhythm change, faster than I had ever heard it, not panicked, urgent, the rhythm of something that is trying to decide. I went back inside. It was in the kitchen when I came through the door. Not in the corner, not folded small, standing in the middle of the kitchen floor in a posture I had not seen before, fully upright, wings partially extended, the copper rows of the scales lit from inside, in a way that the scales did not normally look, as though something had turned a light on under the skin. The amber gold eyes were on the door to the courtyard, not on me, and the horn ridges were vibrating at the edges in a way I had no framework to interpret, except that it looked like the way a person's hands look, when they are trying very hard not to let themselves shake. "They're outside," I said. It looked at me. "Just for a moment, away from the door," I said. "Is that yours?" This is not a rational thing to say. I am aware. I said it anyway. It looked at me for a long moment with those amber gold eyes, and then it looked back at the door, and then it made a sound. The first sound it had ever made at me directly, low and chest deep and resonant. Not language in any sense I could parse, but clearly communicative. Clearly something. And then it moved past me to the door, and I opened the door, and it went out into the courtyard. I followed it because I did not know what else to do. What happened in the courtyard I will describe as accurately as I can, which is to say not very accurately, because I did not have then and do not have now the vocabulary for most of it. The nearest of the 14 ships had descended to low enough that its shadow covered the full extent of the courtyard and the scrubland beyond the garden gate. The hull was close enough that I could see the detail of it, scaled plating, copper and violet in a color range that matched. I noticed with a kind of dislocated calm the color range of the creature standing beside me in the courtyard. The hull was not mechanical in the way I understood mechanics. It was grown, or had been made in a way that made the distinction between built and grown irrelevant, and it carried the marks of long use in the way old things carry them. Worn smooth in some places, deeper textured in others, the whole surface carrying a warmth that I could feel from where I was standing. There were shapes on the hull, along the lower edge of the nearest ship, at the point where the hull met the air most directly, figures, dragon figures, not the small domestic shapes I had spent 2 years learning to read. These were immense, the scale of them only clear because the ship itself was immense, and they moved with the deliberateness of things that are very old and very careful about how they use their weight. They were looking at the courtyard. They were looking at what was standing in the courtyard beside me. The creature, and I am going to stop calling it that, because by this point I understood. without anyone telling me, that creature was not the right word, stood on the courtyard tiles and looked up at the ship and the figures on its lower hull, and the sound it made was not the chest-deep resonance it had made to me in the kitchen. It was something else, something that came from lower down in the body, something that shook the courtyard tiles through the soles of my work shoes, something that I felt in my back teeth and my sternum and somewhere behind my eyes, and that I understood, without language, without translation, purely as a mammal understands the communication of a larger animal. To be, I am here, I am here, I am here. The figures on the hull were very still. Then they were not still. What happened next was slow and deliberate and so large in its physical components. The descent of the nearest ship, another 20 meters. The movement of the figures. The way the air changed as something in the ship's configuration shifted. That I will not try to describe it in sequence, because the sequence does not reduce to a reasonable narrative. What I will tell you is that at some point in the following minutes, the young dragon that I had been feeding in the walls of the Veth estate for 2 years was no longer standing beside me in the courtyard, but was 20 feet away and not on the ground, and that the thing it was doing, the wing extension, the full unfurling of those copper rose to deep violet membranes that I had seen partially, once in the hallway, was the first time I had seen what it actually was, what it was going to be. The span of those wings in full extension, over a cold courtyard in the early autumn on the outer fringe of Orithvel Station, was not the span of a domestic animal or a way station pest or a building problem. It was large. It was very large, and it was still growing, and watching it was the way I imagine watching a fire is. If you have never seen fire before, something in the body recognizes it before the mind knows what to call it. I stood against the courtyard wall, and I watched. The figures from the hull had come down. Not all of them. 2, at the front, and behind them others. They were old. I could tell this without knowing how I could tell it. The scales carried the density and the depth of color that comes, I would later learn, with centuries of maturity. The copper and violet deepened nearly to burgundy and black at the edges, the horn ridges tall and complex in their branching. They moved with the precision of things that have been moving for a very long time, and have learned to be careful. They stopped at the garden gate. The gate, I noted, with the part of my mind that keeps noting things regardless of the circumstance, was still latched. I had latched it the evening before, when I had done my final round of the building. It was a rusted iron latch, one of the few things on the estate I had never bothered to replace, because it worked perfectly well, despite its appearance. The largest of the figures standing at the gate looked at the latch, then it looked at me. I walked across the courtyard and opened the gate. I am not sure what possessed me to do that, rather than standing where I was and letting the moment resolve itself around me. Perhaps 26 years of the work. When something needs opening, you open it. You do not make the situation wait while you process the emotional dimensions of it. They looked at the young dragon in the center of the courtyard, wings extended. They looked at it for a long time. Then they looked at me. I will note, still holding my dusting cloth. I had not thought to put it down. I was wearing my work coat and my work shoes, and my hair was up in the way I wore it for dusty rooms, and I had a damaged notebook in my left coat pocket and a pen behind my ear. I was 55 years old, on a cold autumn morning, standing against the courtyard wall of a derelict estate on the outer fringe of a way station world, and the 2 largest dragons I had ever seen or would ever see were looking at me. I did not know the protocols. I have already told you I did not know the protocols. What I did was the thing I always do when I do not know what else to do. I stood up straight. Not heroic, not presented, just straight. The way my mother told me to stand, when I was young, when she said that you owed it to every situation to meet it upright. The foremost figure, the larger of the 2, the one whose scales had gone the deepest in color, the one who moved as though the ground were a suggestion rather than a requirement, looked at me. The sound it made was not the kind of sound that requires translation. It was the kind of sound that translates itself. I felt it in the same place I had felt the young dragon's courtyard cry, behind the eyes and in the sternum and in the soles of the feet. And what I felt it say, without language, without any shared vocabulary between us, was, "We see you." I did not know, until much later, what the right response to that is. What I did was, I nodded, the way you nod to acknowledge something real. I said nothing, because I did not have anything to say that was proportionate to the situation. I held my dusting cloth, and I stood straight, and I nodded. The larger figure looked at me for another long moment. Then it turned to the young dragon in the courtyard, and made a different sound. A series of sounds, structured, deliberate, and the young dragon's wings came in slowly, and it took 2 steps forward toward the gate, and then stopped and looked back at me. I had not expected that. The looking back, I said. To the young dragon, in the courtyard, the only way I knew how to address it, which was the same way I had been addressing it for 2 years, I said, "Go on, it's all right." It looked at me for another moment. Then it turned back to the gate and walked through it, and the figures from the ship moved back to make a space for it, and it went through. The larger figure did not go immediately. It remained at the garden gate, and it looked at me again, and the sound it made this time was different from any of the others, quieter and slower, and it went into me somewhere below the register of hearing and stayed there. I could not have told you then what it meant. I can tell you now, because someone eventually told me. What it said, translated as closely as Inti's translation of the Kethsor primary tongue can manage, was Keth Dava, the one who kept the air warm. Not a question, not a request, a naming. I did not know that then. I found out 6 weeks later, when a transit authority liaison officer, a very young man who had clearly been told to do this and was not entirely sure how, came to my flat on the mid-ring and delivered a sealed document from the Kethsor Sovereign Flight Line, which I could not read because it was not in a language I had ever learned, and also a verbal message, which the liaison officer delivered with the care of someone repeating something. He had memorized in a language not entirely natural to him. The heir of the Sor founding line, the last egg of the Sor matriarch who had died in transit 2.5 years ago, had been found on the outer fringe of Orithvel Station. The Sovereign Flight Line had searched for 2 years. The heir was alive and in good health, and growing at a rate consistent with adequate nutrition over the preceding 18 to 24 months. The Sovereign Flight Line wished to record, in the terms of their primary lineage tradition, the name of the one who had kept the air warm. The liaison officer said, "They named you Keth Dava." I'm told that means, he checked his notes, the one who kept the air warm. He checked again, a permanent designation. In their records, I said. All right, he said. There may also be, they indicated, there may be some kind of formal acknowledgement at a future date if you were willing. I said. That's very kind, he said. Is there anything you'd like me to convey in response? I thought about this, I said. Tell them. The heating coils were always on. They can check the maintenance logs. The heating coils were always on. He wrote this down with the earnestness of someone who was not sure if it was a diplomatic statement or a practical one, and had decided to treat it as both. He thanked me and left. I put the sealed document on my kitchen table and I looked at it for a while. The way you look at something that belongs to a dimension of things you don't entirely have language for. Then I looked at my schedule for the following morning, which still had the Veth estate on it, because Corin Veth had not yet officially relieved me of the position, and the estate was still standing, and someone needed to check the coil housing before the cold set in properly. I packed my bag. Growth blocks. I didn't know why, habit I suppose, or the simple fact that I had nowhere else to put them. My damage notebook, my flask, the pen I kept behind my ear. I went to bed. In the morning I drove up the gravel lane in the early light and let myself into the estate. The courtyard was empty. The garden gate was latched. I had latched it myself the evening of the day they came, the way I latched everything in the estate before leaving. The pantry was as I had left it. The large water container, the ceramic dishes, the tray on the counter, all empty now and staying empty. The heating coils came on when I ran the test sequence. Nominal. All of them. I went through the ground floor rooms, dusted the mantel in the sitting room, the window ledge in the study, the banister rail at the bottom of the stair. I went through the east wing door, the one I had been told not to go through, the one with the questionable joists, the one I had been going through for nearly 2 years. And I walked the upper corridor with my torch and my notebook. The claw marks were still there at the base of the wall. The old ones I had filled in, and the filler had set clean. The newer ones, the ones from the second winter, when it had been larger, when the pacing marks were deeper, those I could see clearly in the torchlight. I crouched down and I put my hand against the wall, flat-palmed, where the warmth used to be. The wall was cold. Stone cold, the cold of a building that has been empty through the night with no warm body in it. I held my hand there for a moment. Then I stood up and I took out my notebook and I wrote, under East Wing Upper Corridor, condition notes, that the structural integrity was sound, the floor joists were fully weight-bearing, and the space was ready for habitation pending resolution of the sale question and completion of the roof patch on the north exposure. I clicked the pen. I went back downstairs. At the bottom of the stair, where the entrance hall tile was, the one I had regrouted 3 times, the one with the soft substrate. I crouched down and pressed the corner of it. Solid. It had set properly this time. I stood up. I picked up my bag. I went out the front door, and I locked it behind me. I walked down the gravel lane in the early autumn light to where my car was parked at the bottom, and I drove back into the settled fringe of Orthville Station to check the day's other houses. The lane was very quiet behind me. The estate stood where it always stood, at the end of the lane, shuttered and stone gray. In the morning, the courtyard gate latched, the heating coils running steady inside it, keeping the temperature even in every room the way I had kept it for 2 years, the way I kept everything I was responsible for. Properly, and without fuss, and as well as I could manage for as long as it needed. That is all I ever did. I want to be clear about that. I left food, and I kept the heat on, and I said good morning, and I did not tell anyone. Anyone who would like to call that something larger than it was. Anyone who would like to make it a story about something I intended or understood, or chose, is welcome to. The Kethsor records say Keth Dava. The Transit Authority liaison officer wrote it in his notes. It is apparently permanent. I just kept the heat on. That is the whole of it.